Aloha, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christopher Zarnicki. I'm a member of the conference's formational mission team and pastor of First United Protestant Church of Hilo. I'm so glad that you have decided to join us for today's leadership event and this keynote address on leadership and adaptability by Ron Heifetz. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker today. I had the opportunity to hear Ron this past September at the Online Leadership Institute at Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City. After hearing him speak on leadership and adaptability during this time of COVID, I know that you're in for a real treat today. Ron Heifetz is one of the world's foremost authorities on the practice and teaching of leadership. He's advised the heads of governments, businesses, and nonprofit organizations across the globe. He's the author of several leadership books, including the book Leadership on the Line, which I highly recommend. He's currently serving as a professor at Harvard Kennedy School, where his courses on leadership are considered to be legendary and among the most influential. Without further ado, let us please welcome and give a big aloha to Ron Heifetz.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's such a wonderful treat. It gives me goosebumps to see your faces and get to be with you today. I so love the land where my wife and I now live most of the time on the Big Island, and I am so delighted to be welcomed by you, as I have felt so welcomed over the last several years. On your islands. We're on the Big Island, not far from Puako, across the island from where Christopher lives in Hilo, and we very much love the spirit of people here. You know, as beautiful as Hawaii is as a physical place, what drew me most to Hawaii was how kind-hearted people are. That you could simply be checking out at the supermarket or at the drugstore and ask somebody how they were, and they would talk and tell you how they were, and that people weren't impatient with storytelling, and that what mattered was people and relationships. That's what mattered. People might be lined up and back in the checkout counter, but nobody was honking their horn because you were sharing a story with somebody at the as you were checking out, and that kindness. It was very different from where I've lived most of my life in growing up in Los Angeles and then living for the last 40 years on the East Coast in New York, and then most of the 40 years in Boston. In those centers, they're wonderful places to live too. They tend to attract people who have very strong and powerful aspirations to be the best in their field. In New York, the best in the fields of business or the best in the arts. In Boston, the best intellectuals, you know, in the world, because we have great universities and so forth. So that's a very exciting place to live, a very generative places to live. But on the other hand, people are always looking over their shoulder, looking at each other instrumentally. You know, do you have what I need? Are you going to help me get ahead? People sort of look at each other with agendas. But that wasn't true here. You know, people simply took each other, at least in my experience. If I'm wrong, please don't tell me too quickly. But people seem to look at each other as just people, you know, with lives to share and stories to tell, and that was, you know, deeply attractive to my wife and I. So thank you very much for welcoming me to your community. I want to share with you some of the lessons that I've learned in thinking about leadership over the course of my career. I didn't begin thinking about leadership. I didn't begin thinking of myself as a professor or as a teacher. I began training in medicine. I was going to be a doctor. And I finished medical school. And I finished my first year of training. I was going to work with my father. My father was a great brain surgeon. And growing up in Los Angeles, he was well known around the world for his creativity as a neurosurgeon. And I loved my father and I wanted to work with him. So I thought I would become a neurosurgeon as well. But after my first year of surgical training, I took a moonlighting job to, I took 1 year off before starting my neurosurgical training. I thought I would take a year off, and I went back to study music for the year. And during that year, in order to support my musical habit, I took the first part-time, we call it moonlighting job, that I was able to get as a young doctor. And the first moonlighting job I was able to get, this was in New York City, was at the big prison for New York City. It's called Rikers Island Prison. If you've ever flown into LaGuardia Airport in New York City, you fly right over that prison. The pilot doesn't ever say, look out your right window, you can see the prison. They always say, look out your window, you can see the Manhattan skyline. There's the Empire State Building, you know. And but actually, what you see right beneath you is this prison. And I used to work there for about 6 months as the doctor all night long. And my job primarily was to take care of medical emergencies. But those were very few, because most of the people coming into the prison at Rikers Island were young, and so they were physically pretty healthy. So what kept me up all night were not medical emergencies. What kept me up all night was the job of examining the inmates as they would come into the prison from the local jails. They would come into the prison from the local jails, sometimes 100 people a night. Buses of young people coming into the prison. And they were entitled to a medical examination. So I would examine each of these people as they would be brought into the prison. And that's what kept me up all night long. And the problems of these people began to change my whole view of my career, because there were patterns of social illness. Nearly everybody coming into the prison was poor. And nearly everybody in the prison was a minority. In New York City, most were African American, or they were Latino, Latinx. There were no firstborn sons from the wealthy suburbs looking like me, you know, a white boy coming into the prison. Everybody had in their own life experienced injustice. And in their own crazy way, they were doing justice, you know, or injustice back into the system, and getting themselves into trouble and ending up in jail. So I decided I wanted to be a doctor at the aggregate level, at the systems level, rather than being a doctor one-on-one. And that set me on a course, a 5-year course of transitioning in my career. I left my neurosurgical training and decided I would finish my medical training in psychiatry, and then I would study politics and public policy, which I did at the Kennedy School of Government, where I teach at Harvard. And then I began to develop a way to think about the practice of leadership in social policy and public affairs. So for a long time now, I just turned 70 years old last Sunday. For 37 years, since I was 33 years old, I've been teaching leadership at the Kennedy School. And I've also had the opportunity to fly into many different environments around the world. Some of them, you know, very high-powered environments. Some of them very local environments, to work with people on how to lead their own communities in facing the challenges that they face. So I want to share with you some of the lessons that I've learned from listening to people's stories for these nearly 40 years. You know, in Hawaii, you have the notion of talk story, but listening to stories is also the fundamental diagnostic mechanism in medicine. In medicine, the first thing you're taught as a young doctor is to take the history, is to listen to the patient's story, because the story has most of the information you need to diagnose the problem. And whatever you can't diagnose from the story, then you lay your hands on and do some physical examination. And then you do some tests and use high technology to do various tests, blood tests and CT scans and x-rays. But most of the information you need comes from listening to a person's story. So I had the opportunity, having had that training, to listen to people's stories over many, many years. Indeed, I designed my classes based on having people share their own cases, their own stories, their stories of leadership success, but also their stories of failure. And most of what I have learned over the years has been because I've listened to many people's stories around the world as they've tried to practice leadership in their communities. I've tried to come up with generalizations, general principles, and that's what I'd like to share with you today. I don't really know which of the principles I have to share with you will apply to your particular communities. So maybe some of my ideas will apply and some of my ideas are irrelevant. I don't know which they are. So you'll have to test them out in conversation with each other, and with your own people in your community to begin to evaluate which ideas might help you see new options and which ideas are not very useful. Do any of you have any questions about me before I begin to share some of my ideas? If you do, just unmute yourself, or if you want, you can throw a question into the chat space, which I'm looking at, and I can respond to your question. Okay, so leadership itself as a field of study is an immature field. It's a very young field. It's not mature like the field of medicine or engineering or any of the trades, carpentry or being an electrician or a plumber. All of those crafts and disciplines have long, long histories of study. And over time, people have come to clarify, the basic vocabulary, the basic language. So when a carpenter talks to a carpenter, they can talk in shorthand because they have their own expert vocabulary to talk about their tools and what's needed, in the engineering of building a house. And same thing with a person who lives at sea. They'll speak in shorthand if they're a navigator on all the different tools of navigation as they use the stars or as they use instruments to navigate. And that's also true in medicine. But the field of leadership is not mature in that way. So if you pick up a book on leadership, or if you read a newspaper article about leadership, people will use the same words in very different ways. And that makes it very confusing. It would be as if two carpenters were talking about the length of a piece of wood, a 2x4, and not knowing how long an inch is, because one thinks an inch is this long and another thinks an inch is that long. So what is a 2x4? How big is it? Well, that's kind of the problem in leadership studies. There's a lot of confusion about how even to define our basic words: leadership, authority, power, influence, follower, citizen, member, management. These basic words themselves are not agreed upon. Our field isn't mature enough so that over generations, people have finally agreed upon, the basic way to think about leadership. And it's kind of a paradox because even though the field is very immature or undisciplined, it's also a very ancient field because there's so much to learn about the practice of leadership if we read ancient texts, including our ancient texts, from Bible. There's so much in the Old and New Testament that teaches us about the practices of leadership. And yet the way we analyze leadership itself as a practice is still a fairly immature area of study. A lot of my work over these 40 years has been to try to come up with a more coherent way of using these terms so that they have more precision. In the same way that a carpenter or a cardiologist or a physicist, somebody working in Waimea with the, trying to gaze at the stars, will have a expert vocabulary where they use commonly used words, but in very, very specific ways for their own expert purposes. So I'd like to begin there. One of the primary sources of confusion in thinking about leadership is that people confuse leadership with authority. We see this every day because if you pick up a newspaper article or a book, people will talk about the leadership of the congregation, the leadership of the country, the leadership of the Congress, the leadership of a business, the leadership of the municipality, or the leadership of a school board. In all of those cases, people are not actually talking about leadership. They're talking about people in positions of authority. We know that leadership and authority are not the same thing because we complain frequently about the lack of leadership of our, quote, leaders. We say the leadership isn't exercising any leadership, or the leaders aren't leading. And we can say that, in an informal way, but those of you in the practice of leadership, as each of you is called to do in your community, needs a more precise way of thinking about how leadership is not the same as having a position of authority. In fact, we know that there are a lot of people who exercise leadership without authority. They don't wait to be called into play by the coach. They don't wait to be elected. They don't wait to be anointed or promoted into a senior position. They simply see a problem in their community and they begin to mobilize the people in their community to work that problem together. And that is leadership. That is the essence of leadership. Mobilizing people within your community to work a collective problem. And indeed, we see a lot of people historically who've been doing that all over the countryside. Indeed, in each of our own communities, there are a lot of people who've been practicing leadership during this pandemic, mobilizing their own families or their own neighbors or people within your church community to meet the challenge, to adjust their lives, to figure out how will we continue to feed those people who are without food? How will we continue to house people who are at risk of losing their home? How will we learn to pray together when people feel deeply lonely and are even at risk of suicide or alcoholism because they're so lonely? And we've had a lot of people who've practiced leadership, not waiting, but simply because they care, who've had the skill and the commitment and the devotion to provide that leadership without authority. And then we've also seen some people in positions of authority who have practiced a lot of leadership, who have mobilized the communities, our communities in our cities and in our counties and in our states and in our countries, who have mobilized the communities to make the adjustments we need to make to limit the death rate and to keep people healthy. And we've also seen a wide spectrum because we've seen a lot of people in positions of authority who have not practiced leadership at all, who've misled at best. You could say they've practiced misleadership, but not really leadership. And so we look around the world and we see that in some countries, there have been prime ministers and presidents who've done a great job of limiting the death rate because they courageously challenged and mobilized their people to do what every person needs to do locally in their own families and lives to meet this pandemic. But we've also seen countries where the death rate is very high, including our country, the United States, where we've had people, senior people in government, who have denied the reality and increased the death rate by not challenging people to do what they need to do in order to stay safe and to keep each other safe. So it's very important when we begin to distinguish leadership from authority. Because when we begin to distinguish leadership from authority, that begins to help us raise the question, what does it mean when you, are the authority figure in the church. When you're the pastor, or when you're the deacon, or when you're the lay leader, when you're president of the board, or president of the congregation, or when you're the school teacher, you have an authority position. What does it mean for you to practice leadership in your community? But also, perhaps one of your levers, as many of you know, is to generate leadership from the membership itself, so that you're not the only one practicing leadership, but you're building a community of people where other people are practicing leadership too, coming up with the creative idea, coming up with a mechanism to pray together, electronically through Zoom, coming up with new ways to provide education for the children, and new ways to help people stay safe or to feed their families. The second major source of confusion about leadership is that people think of leadership as a set of personal characteristics. But there is no single set of personal characteristics that defines leadership. The kinds of characteristics that we would say we need in a leader are not specific to leadership. They're basic human characteristics that we need in a lot of different areas of our life. For example, a stomach for conflict, a stomach for uncertainty, an ability to listen carefully, a passionate commitment to your people, your ability to improvise depending on the needs of the situation. All of those characteristics are very important if you're the parent of a teenager. The ability to listen, a stomach for conflict, a stomach for uncertainty, keeping your eyes on the prize. What are you trying to accomplish? Sometimes you just want to kill this child. They're so upsetting. You're so upset. They're so disrespectful. They're so uncontrollable. They're so terrifying to you because of the danger they can create for themselves. And but you have to keep your eye on the long term, what you're trying to achieve. So there is no single characteristic set for what it means to practice leadership. Indeed, the idea that some people are born to be leaders and many people are not is a dangerous idea. Because what that idea means is that many people think they're either born with the right stuff, then they're dangerous because then they don't realize how much they need to learn. They just think they know it already. And then you get most other people who don't think they have the right stuff, and then they wait. They wait for the leader to emerge. In the Jewish community, we're waiting for the Messiah to come for the first time. You're waiting for the second time, but people get stuck in a waiting mode rather than realizing we are called to do the work that God calls us to do. And the idea that then leaders are born and not made means for a lot of people, they are stuck in a mode of dependency rather than discovering their own capacity, their own agency for taking action, even within their own local reach. That is leadership. Leadership doesn't mean that you get to be the mayor, or the governor, or the state senator, or the president of the company. Anybody can practice leadership from authority positions or from any place in an organization or in a community, simply because they see a problem and they begin to mobilize people to work that problem. So when we begin to distinguish leadership from any set of personal characteristics, we can begin to empower and encourage everybody to practice leadership within whatever problem domain they're living, and to begin to disabuse people, to demystify the notion, or that only some people can do it, and the rest of us have to simply wait. The problem with waiting is that most of the time people in positions of authority will not step up to the plate to the degree they need to. Because the challenges that we face generally means that the people in highest positions of authority are a little overwhelmed. They're in over their head. All of the presidents and prime ministers of countries that I've worked with are in over their heads. They're all overwhelmed. They don't show you publicly how overwhelmed they are because then they would look weak. But, you know, behind the scenes, they're full of uncertainty and sleepless nights. The good ones are. The bad ones con themselves into believing that they know what they're doing. Then they're more dangerous. But the good ones know that they're dealing with uncertainty and they're constantly trying to figure out, what do I need to do next? So what then is the work of leadership? If leadership's not a set of personal characteristics, what are the kinds of situations for which we need leadership in the world? And I think the kinds of situations that we need leadership for, you know, if we think of leadership as a craft, like carpentry, or being a plumber, or being a doctor, or being a lawyer, you know, each of those lines of business, lines of work, being a preacher, each of those lines of work specify a particular kind of work we do with people. You know, a cardiologist works with heart problems. A lawyer works with legal problems. A carpenter works with, you know, housing problems. An electrician works with electrical problems. You know, an accountant works with accounting problems. What are the kinds of problems for which we need leaders? And not simply people with authoritative knowledge. I think the kinds of problems for which we need leadership are exactly the kind of challenge we find ourselves in right today. The pandemic is a beautiful example and a terrible example of the kind of challenge for which we so desperately need leadership. And I call those challenges adaptive challenges because they force us to build new capacity. They force us, just like in evolution, in God's design of evolution, they force us to come up with new capacity or the organism will perish. It will become a fossil if it doesn't develop new capacity. You know, when birds first arrived on the islands of Hawaii, before human beings, they were carried by wind or maybe by, you know, pieces of lumber. Somehow they ended up landing on this island. And when they first were here, they weren't particularly adapted to this island, to these islands, to the kind of food on these islands. But they did, over generations, develop new capacity that made them particularly effective on these islands. You know, where they could break open certain kinds of seed, different than the kinds of seed that existed back, you know, wherever they came from, in whichever mainland they came from. Or to be able to fish for certain kinds of fish differently than they were able to catch, you know, in other waters. And that ability in evolution to create local adaptations to local environments so that each species of life is beautifully adapted to its local environment so that it can thrive in its local environment. That's how evolution works. And and those are the kinds of challenges then for which we need leadership. When a community is faced with a changed environment or a challenging environment, and somehow people have to be mobilized to develop new capacity, to learn new ways, where they can't simply do what they know how to do already and solve the problem. Problems that are known, we could call those problems technical problems. But problems that have large components of the unknown, we could call adaptive challenges, because just like in nature, they challenge the organism or they challenge the organization to develop new capacity or risk perishing. And I think it's these kinds of challenges for which we need leadership. These kinds of challenges, you don't need leadership. You need a good carpenter. You need a good doctor. You need a good authority figure with authoritative expertise. You know, if it's a big organization, you need somebody with managerial expertise. You need a good manager. Now, in your organizations, in your churches, you have both sets of problems. You do have technical problems, problems for which you have the know-how already. You know, you've seen the problem already. You're an elder. You've been around. You know how to work that problem with people. They may not know how to work that problem, but like a good carpenter, you know how to work that problem. But there are other challenges where you don't know completely how to work the problem because the problem itself requires discovery. It requires people to learn new things. It requires people to invent or experiment or develop, new ways of doing things. So these kinds of challenges are the home territory of leadership. And these kinds of challenges, technical challenges, are the home territory of authoritative experts or managerial experts. You have to do both. You have to learn enough about finances to manage the finances of a church community. You have to learn enough about, memberships to figure out how to manage memberships. And of course, many of you who are preachers, you went to seminary and you learned text, and you learned how to interpret text, and you learned how to speak, and give a sermon. And so when the next Sunday approaches, you have a feeling, what passage of the Bible do you want to speak to? And to some degree, you're being creative, but you're being creative within your domain of expertise. Creative in the same way that the carpenter has to be creative, because each house is a little bit different. But mainly they're drawing on their know-how. But you also are facing problems that require the development of other people's new capacity. I began to discover this difference in medicine, because in medicine, we face a lot of problems for which we have the know-how. We can prescribe the remedy, and solve it for people. We can give them the child penicillin or some analog of penicillin to cure the ear infection. A child breaks his leg, we can cast the leg, and 6 weeks later, take off the cast, and the child will walk again. But there are some problems that are a combination. They're part technical, but they're also part adaptive. An example of this would be heart disease. Part of that problem we can treat with surgery or medication. But part of that problem remains lodged in the behavior of the patient, so that the responsibility for solving that problem has to shift from just the expert, here's your penicillin, I'll fix it for you, to I fixed my part of the problem, but now you have to fix your part. You have to take responsibility for your diet, for your smoking, for your exercise, for your stress. Because I can work very hard to redo the vessels to your heart and give you new plumbing. But those vessels will clog up again if you don't do your part. And so in medicine, we see this combination of challenges that are part technical but part adaptive. Because if the patient doesn't learn new ways, the doctor's handiwork, won't do all that it might do. And it turns out it's very hard to get patients to change their diet or get exercise or stop smoking. The compliance rate after cardiac surgery is only about 20%. 80% of people do not follow the doctor's instructions, even after something as painful as cardiac surgery. They don't change their diet, they don't stop smoking, they don't get exercise, even though they've almost died. So the adaptive work that we're trying to challenge people to do is hard work. It's emotionally hard for people. And I want to explain why it's hard. Adaptive work, if we look at nature, involves three big questions. What in nature, the question would be, what DNA, what part of our genetic makeup can we conserve? And God is very conservative. God did not do zero-based budgeting in evolving life on our earth. Evolution is very conservative. The chemistry with which you're going to turn your next meal into energy, food into energy, that chemistry has not changed in 3.5 billion years. It's the same membrane chemistry that is used by bacteria, single-celled organisms. The genetic code that we have hasn't changed since the beginning of life, 3.8 billion years ago. And it's the same genetic code in a bacteria as it is in a human being. So most DNA is conserved, even when you go transformative change in a community. So the cultural DNA, if we draw an analogy, the cultural DNA, the first question is, what are we going to conserve? What's precious and essential to conserve? The next question is very difficult. What are we going to discard? What in our culture no longer is serviceable? What in our way of life no longer works? Perhaps you grew up in a family that has a long tradition of eating a certain kind of food, and now your doctor is telling you stop eating those foods. That's very, very hard work, because you want to conserve most of your culture, but somebody's telling you have to give up a part of your culture. And that culture is anchored in your deep connection and love of your family and your ancestry. And so it's no surprise that people have such difficulty changing their diet. Because, whenever they want to remember home, they simply need to cook that food. And there they are back in their mother's kitchen. So, the losses involved in cultural change, in adaptive change, the losses are very significant. And then the third task in adaptive change is innovation. What innovation? What innovation will enable us to take the best of our history, the best of our tradition, the best of our knowledge into the future? It would be wonderful if adaptive work required no losses. But that is rarely the case. Something usually has to be lost. And the losses generate a lot of resistance. You may know the phrase that people resist change, but it's not really true. Nobody anywhere in the world gives up a winning lottery ticket. People love change when when they're pretty sure it's a good thing. People love getting a raise. They love getting a new car, particularly, if they win a new car in a raffle, they don't, they love the change. People don't resist change itself. People resist the possibility of loss when the change involves the reality or the possibility of a loss. It's the losses that people resist, not the change itself. So in the pandemic, we're all experiencing an enormous loss. We're trying to hold on to as much of our way of life as we can, but there's this terrible loss. There's the central direct loss that people in our lives are dying. And then there's the central loss of social community, of physical contact. We're seeing each other's faces, but we're not getting to hug each other. We're not getting to hold hands. We're not getting to sit across the table, and talk all night long, over a meal. Those are enormous losses. And the adaptive challenge that we're facing also requires innovation. People have to discover and invent new ways. And what we learn from nature is that the discoveries are not the same everywhere. Different families are going to need to invent different adaptations to their particular family, different churches to their particular community. Some of your churches have less than 50 people, many of your churches. So what's the adaptations in a very small church community? How do you help people stay glued together so that nobody goes into despair? That's the question you've been working for the last almost year. But some of your communities are larger, so you have more resources. And your innovations will be different. So these three questions: what is essential and precious to conserve? What do we have to accept losing? And what innovation will enable us to take the best of our identity, of our community into the future? Those are the essential three questions of adaptive work. And I think in a way, those become the essential three questions of leadership work. Mobilizing people to work those three sets of questions. Now, leadership's not the same as being the expert. So as the authority figure, you don't have to have the answer to all of those questions. You're never going to have the answer to all of those questions. You may have many good ideas. You may even have the beginning of answers. Your job is to mobilize people in your community to come up with these answers. For example, if I'm the doctor after surgery asking a patient to change their diet, I cannot know what their diet really means to them within their family, within their culture, within their heritage, because I may be an outsider to that heritage. I can ask them general questions. I can bring the family together and say, I know you want to honor your heritage and your families, and this is part of what it means to be family, but you're going to have to let go of this one and rely on other means. Now, I can't help you figure out, how to make those trade-offs, how to have the conversation when you go visit with your elder and they want to feed you food that's going to kill you. I can't tell you how to have that conversation. And how do you say, with love in your heart, no, thank you, Granny? How do you say that? I don't know. That has to be particular to the particular people. So part of your job is to raise the key questions to people so that they do their work in making the adjustments necessary to become a church in this new community, in this new reality. And the wonderful thing I'm discovering as a teacher, because I'm forced to do this too. I've resisted teaching online, teaching virtually for 30 years. I've had colleagues experiment with teaching this way, all the benefits that you can teach people far away. And I've said, no, I really need to see people in a room. I need to hold them. I need to see their faces. I need to work with them in person. Because what I'm teaching people is really personal. And I've just resisted it. But now I've been forced to teach this way, into a screen of little boxes. Now the term public square has whole new meaning. I've got a whole public set of squares in front of me. But I've developed new capacity. I've realized, you can design a whole semester-long course, a whole workshop, where you teach matters of the heart and spirit as well as intellect. Even when people are looking into a screen together. And so I don't want to go back to old times. And there's a strong pull. Maybe the pandemic will finally be over, for all of us within 6 months. probably we'll all have a vaccine. I'm 70 years old, so maybe I'll get it in the spring. My wife, she's 60, she'll be 64 years old in a few weeks. So she's lumped together with the 25-year-olds. So she may not get a vaccine until the summer. Whenever it happens, that will be our time. But eventually, you know, I will be teaching in person again. But now I have new capacity. It would be a mistake to simply go backwards. And I hope that's true for all of you too, because there will be a beautiful, delicious feeling of returning home where we can hold each other and pray and sing together and hear each other's voices and stay up all night talking and eating together. But there's also new capacity that we shouldn't lose, that we're developing this year. And I don't know what that new capacity is, but my guess is that different churches, different communities have been developing different experiments and experimenting and developing, you know, different ways of bringing people together. And I hope you build further on those new capacities rather than try to just retreat to old times. Let me give you an example. In my work with churches, there's a real problem in attracting young people. And many of the churches are aging out of existence. So developing new capacity to connect with people, as you're forced to do right now, may also become really valuable as you continue to work the frontier of developing new capacity, new adaptations, new capacity to speak to the hearts and lives of young people and to renew your congregations. Because there are a lot of young people going to different kinds of churches, you know, including the mall, which is sort of the new church in America on Sunday. I want to open this up to conversation, but let me tell you one quick story from my own Jewish community, my ancestry. But of course, we share the same ancestry because Jesus was one of our boys. You know, he was, when I was lonely once on the Jewish New Year, after giving a talk in England, the only place I could find a Jewish person to celebrate the holiday was a local church because Jesus was there. So I sat there and I communed with Jesus, and I said, you know, we're a couple of Jews. Let's talk. And so I communed with Jesus and I asked Jesus, what do these people mean by Sacred Heart? You know, the Christian community. Tell me what they mean by Sacred Heart. So, you know, so he and I communed on the Jewish New Year. So, and I got a big message. If you have a chance to look at my book called Leadership on the Line, the last chapter called Sacred Heart is that what I learned from that communion in that church. So one of the adaptations that we were forced to face as a community was just after Jesus, 37 years after Jesus was killed or sacrificed. A small group of Jews decided to try to push back the Roman Empire. And they started to fight with the Roman Empire. They started a war, a guerrilla war, to liberate their people. And they fought heroically, but finally, after 2 years, they had to retreat to a mountaintop in the Judean desert called Masada, where more than 800 of them, families and warriors, for a full year, they lived on that mountaintop. But finally, the Romans built up a ramp, literally a whole earthen ramp. They built a ramp up to the top of that plateau so that they could bring up their wall penetrating machinery and to overtake that community. That whole community ended up committing collective suicide because they decided we would rather be dead than be enslaved by the Romans. You could say in the Jewish community, in my community, that this was a great heroic act. But it was actually, from my point of view, a terribly wasteful act. To pick a fight with people much bigger than you is not the right thing to do. The fight they picked ended up generating the destruction of the great temple in Jerusalem and the diaspora and enslavement and scattering of my people all over the world. Now, one group continued to fight. For another 70 years, they kept fighting. But another person practiced the kind of leadership that I've been describing. His name was Yochanan ben Zakkai. Yochanan, the son of Zakkai. Yochanan said, I think we're going to have to reinvent Judaism. We're going to have to figure out how to make our faith community portable so that it can live anywhere and so that our people can remain faithful even when they're spread out around the world. So he persuaded the Roman emperor, the Roman general, to let him start a school. The Romans loved education because they modeled themselves after the Greeks. And so they said to this rabbi, yes, sure, you can start a school. I don't see you as a threat. So the rabbi started a school. It's just south of Tel Aviv. It's in a town called, a little village called Yavne. And that school has now been operating continuously for almost 2,000 years. Since just after 70 AD, that school has continued to operate. I visited it myself a few years ago. It's a Bible study school, of course, within the Jewish tradition, so it's studying Old Testament. Now, one of the first things he did was bring together the elders of his day, the great wise people of his day. He brought them together and he asked them these three painful questions. What do we conserve? What do we discard? And what innovation will we need to accomplish in order to bring our people into the world they're going to live in order to sustain our people in slavery and exile, in diaspora? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he did not have the answer to those questions. What he had was the questions. And then he built a school to bring people together to work those questions. And he held them in debate and argument as they worked those questions. What innovation will enable us to keep our people alive? And they worked those questions for more than a generation. They worked those questions for 100 years. And they came up with several major innovations. All of us, Christians and Jews, are the beneficiaries of these innovations. The first innovation was the Bible. Before then, there was no collected canon. There were many sacred texts. They had never been gathered together into one collection of sacred texts. So then they argued. They argued day and year after year. Which texts do we include in the Bible and which texts do we exclude? And those were very passionate debates, very painful debates, because, people had their own attachments to which texts were most sacred. One of the great rabbis was named Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said the most sacred text in the whole collection of sacred texts is the Song of Songs. or what you know in the New Testament as the Song of Solomon. The other rabbis said to Akiba, "Are you kidding? That's a joke. The Song of Songs does not mention God even once. It doesn't give people stories of heroic, salvation. It doesn't give people law and guidance. It's sex. It's a love poem." And Akiba said, "Yes, that's right. It's a song about love. And if God's not about love, then what good is the rest of it?" So the rabbis argued with Akiba. But Akiba had a lot of, credibility in everybody's eyes. And of course, finally they made a deal. They said, "Okay, Akiba, it's only 5 pages long. It's not so long. And I really feel passionate about Second Chronicles, or Kings. So I'll trade you, you vote for Kings and I'll vote for Song of Songs." Now, we don't think of the Bible as the outcome of a political bargain, but it really was. It was a human construction as people struggled with the problem. How do we give our people in exile a single book, that they can turn to for inspiration, for love, for guidance, for law, for hope, for faith? The second big innovation was the sanctuary. And you benefit from this innovation too, because they realized, for 1,000 years, the sanctuary was the great temple in Jerusalem. First it was built by King Solomon in 1000 BC, 1100 BC. And then it was rebuilt, by as Cyrus allowed Nehemiah and Ezra and the prophets in about 450 BC to build the temple again. And then, so that was the great sanctuary. And all of religious life was organized around the priests, who would say the priestly blessing over the community every Sabbath and pray via sacrifice. But now the sanctuary was gone. The great sanctuary was gone. So what will be the sanctuary? We need a sanctuary. And they came up with this brilliant innovation. The sanctuary will no longer be a physical structure. It will be a social structure. The new sanctuary will be the family. Because wherever we are in exile, there will be a family. Well, then if the sanctuary will be the family, who will play the role of the priests? Because, with the destruction of the temple and with the exile, many of the laws, maybe a third of the laws in the Old Testament became obsolete. So who will be the priests? Well, they said, the father will be the priest. This was 2,000 years ago. Now the mother as well will give the priestly blessing over the children at the beginning of the Sabbath in the sanctuary of the family. And so I, as a father, was authorized because of this wonderful innovation 2,000 years ago to bestow the priestly blessing over my children every Sabbath. Yivarechecha ya vayishmarecha ya'er ya panav elecha v'yichunecha yisa ya panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God bless you and keep you. May she shine her face unto you and be gracious unto you. May she love you, care for you. May the Red Sox win and grant you peace. Because you see, I'm authorized to bestow blessings, and because my children were growing up in Boston, I could, make it up the way I wanted. So that was another major innovation, the sanctuary. And of course, the priesthood became obsolete. So the new priesthood really became the teachers. The rabbis became the authority figures. But they weren't prophets. And they weren't priests. You know, they were teachers. And finally, the fourth major innovation was prayer. People didn't pray anymore through sacrifice of animals. People prayed through meditation, through communion, through song, through gathering. You know, that was a whole new form of prayer. Now, the Jewish community mourns the destruction of the great temple. There's a holiday, and we fast on that holiday. It's usually in August each year. But I think the destruction of the great temple in Jerusalem, as tragic as it was also a blessing, because it forced the Jewish community to innovate. It forced the Jewish community to clarify what was truly essential, what was truly precious, and what was peripheral and expendable. And that is very hard, painful work for any community that loves its culture, that loves its tradition, that loves its heritage, that has to then sift through what to let go, but what to keep, and that is forced to innovate. But I think that is what we're all called to do, because we're living in times that force us to make new adaptations every day. So let me stop there, in the hope that all of us can be inspired to be like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, pull our community together to work these three questions, to come up with innovations, to recommit ourselves to what's most essential and precious in our identity, in our tradition, in our heritage, to figure out what is the new hybridization between what we've imported from outside and what is indigenous to our community. You know, a task that Hawaiians have been working with the Christianization of these islands for the last 150 years. How will we draw inspiration from Christianity, and how will we celebrate what it means to be Hawaiian? And those who are not indigenous to these islands, how can we be enriched in our own culture of what we ever bring here from what is also local and indigenous to this community? So that in all of the diversity of all the different peoples that inhabit these islands, we can all come up with local adaptations within our own families and neighborhoods and communities that integrate and are enriched by the diversity that we all represent. And even in a community of 50 people, I think these become essential processes of leadership. Again, people will not do adaptive work without the necessity to do it. Why would people lose or give anything away that they love from their culture if there wasn't some pinch of reality forcing them to do it? But we're all forced to do it. The pandemic is teaching us a lot about how to do this adaptive work. And now if we can apply some of those lessons to the other adaptive challenges you face, you know, the building up of your membership, the building of your community, helping people in their lives get on with their lives, attracting young people, giving people a thoughtful view of religious text, not a formulaic view of religious text, which is so attractive to people as they yearn for certainty. So anyway, thank you so much for, I feel a little negligent talking so long. Please forgive me for talking so long. And thank you for not getting too impatient with me. And let me open it up for general discussion now. If you have any questions or commentary, please.
This is Julie Buto from the Hawaii Conference staff, and we did have some questions come in through the chat. Realizing that people are resisting potential or actual loss is, I think, incredibly important. How does that change our approach to leading in adaptive change from the idea that people resist change?
I think you have to have enormous compassion and respect for the pains of change that you're asking people to suffer. And so it begins with mourning those losses with people. And people believing that you understand what you're asking them to go through, and that it's not trivial, these losses. So I think it begins with compassion and respect and curiosity. Tell me more. I see that you're resisting. Tell me more what it means to you. A cardiac surgeon doesn't have a lot of patience. When the patient comes back for their checkup and they weigh the patient on the scale, and they can smell the cigarette smoke on, even though the patient is trying to hide that they're still smoking. The cardiac surgeon doesn't say, tell me more. How are you struggling? I know I gave you these instructions. I know you're thinking about it, but I see that you're losing the battle. Tell me what's so hard about this battle. The cardiac surgeon just says, listen, I told you what to do. I don't have any time for you. But your job is to draw on all of your knowledge as pastoral counselors, as people who love, to get closer to what people are resisting, to get to know, for example, not on the pandemic, but on the problem of how to attract young people. What is it that young people are attracted to? What is it that you're not speaking to? What do you need to learn how to do differently in organizing your church in order to speak to those people and their needs, to meet them where they are? And that takes a lot of open-hearted questioning, curiosity, compassion. So I think the losses I think it starts there. And exactly where to go from there depends on the answers you get as you begin to understand, the severity of the loss for people. What kind of supports do they need to move through those losses? Do they need a daily call? Do they need a daily reminder? If it were about, if I continue to use this medical example, do they need training in how to cook that kind of food that doesn't smell like mama anymore? And is there any way to doctor up the food to make it smell at least a little bit like mama, even though it's still, made out of tofu or lettuce, and so forth? One has to join the problem-solving work you're asking that person to do, or those people to do, not treating the losses as trivial.
This is Dorothy Lester with a question that was early in the conversation, and that is, would you say that leadership is always or most commonly a response to a perceived problem?
Mostly, yes. But then it depends on how you define a problem. Every problem represents a gap between a value or an aspiration and the current reality, the current situation. There's a gap. And sometimes, and that space, that gap defines a problem space. And every problem has that feature, this structure. It could be as simple a problem as, at my age, I have to go to the bathroom at night a lot. So it's dark and I don't want to trip. So that's a problem. So I have a value called not getting hurt on the way to the bathroom, and I have a reality that it's dark. Well, I can close that gap pretty fast because I keep next to my bed, my phone, and if I just open the phone, it gives me just enough light to see. So every problem is a gap. I'm hungry. That's the reality. I'm hungry. I have a value called feeding myself. I can close that gap, after we're done and go make myself breakfast. Now, some of these gaps don't close very easily. I have a community, I have a church that's a small community with an aging population, and I'm not attracting the young people. The young people are attracted by, by no church at all, or by a church that is selling certainty or selling something else, and we're at risk of dying out. But I think there's something valuable here that we have. And here's this reality, and I don't know how to close that gap. Now, whenever you have that realization that you don't know how to close that gap, you're dealing with an adaptive challenge, because it's a challenge that requires new capacity. It's like the bird that ends up in Hawaii, 10,000 years ago, and it doesn't know quite how to feed yet here. It knows enough to survive and have babies, but it takes many generations for those babies to get stronger and more capable in accessing the particular kinds of foods here. So closing these gaps is harder to do when it's an adaptive challenge. When it's a technical problem, these gaps close quickly. I have an electrical problem. I call an electrician. The electrician comes and he fixes the problem. So in a sense, all of us are in the business of problem solving. But a big part of the problem solving is also clarifying what values are you trying to realize. And so adaptive work has two components. What reality are we facing? What does the pandemic demand of us? And of course, there's uncertainty, but we do know certain things. Masks help, social distancing help. Maybe even double masking will be necessary if this new virus variant, begins to really propagate around here, and so forth. But we also have the second job of clarifying what values matter to us. And as a religious person, a lot of your job is reminding people of the higher values that we stand for. Love, justice, community, the preservation of what's most precious and essential in the Hawaiian culture, and so forth. So you have both jobs, the diagnostic work of assessing the reality, but also the clarification of what values are at stake. And much of the cultural DNA to conserve are those values. That's what the rabbis were doing when they created the Bible. What value are we trying to promote? That's what Akiba was saying when he said we need the Song of Solomon.
This is Sam from the Big Island.
Yes, Sam. Good to see you.
One of the I'm calling from Big Island, from Lanakila Church. I think the word change is always resistive. People are resistant to when you say change. Why do I have to change? It's been da-da-da. But it's more like, we want to improve. The doctors always say not change, but improve your health. And you have to do this, do that. And you are more receptive to something like that rather than the change. The word change is more like a resistance to the word change. So why do I have to change? I'm doing okay. So I think your comment on that, values are very important. If you have the value, and that's very constant about your love, justice, the community, and culture. And then when problems comes within the church community or in the community, then we need to hang on to that. We need to hang on to those values and come up with the diagnosis. You diagnose the problem and then come up with the solution by mobilizing the community together. There are a lot of manawa. There are a lot of good manawa, the knowledge that we have from my grandmother, and graduated from high school. That's about all. But she is like a PhD person. She has incredible knowledge by experience, So I think we need to pull those resources within our community and identify this problem and then come up with the solution to deal with the problem. So every community is very different.
Yes.
Even Kona is very different from Hilo.
Yeah. Yes, very different. Yeah. Yeah. And Waimea is different too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let me see if I can help by helping you analyze losses into 3 categories. Because you're going to face resistance to change because there's resistance to loss. So one has to know how to begin to think about and move closer to understanding those losses. So the first category of loss are direct material losses. Jobs, wealth, status, significance. People care about those things a lot, obviously. So those losses are really significant. Of course, loss of life, The second category is loss of competence. People are really proud of their competence. But leadership frequently, new capacity requires, if you imagine that there's a frontier, new capacity requires taking people across the frontier of their competence. And it's in this zone of incompetence that people learn new ways and begin to push the frontier outwards. So that's a hard place for people to be. People don't like to hang out feeling incompetent. And that causes people to ricochet back off the frontier. And, when they get to the frontier, they ricochet back and stay within their zone of competence. They keep doing what they're good at doing because that's where they feel proud. And depending on their family and their upbringing, some people will feel really ashamed if they feel incompetent. They begin to have the identity of a competent, knowledgeable person. That makes it hard for them to feel excited about, wow, this is new terrain. I don't know what we're doing, but let's figure it out. Some people have that adventurous spirit, but other people are pretty, it's a big loss of competence. The third form of loss is perhaps the most profound. It's the loss of loyalty. Because we all feel anchored. Our cultural DNA is anchored in relationships, to our families, to our community, to our elders, to our ancestors. And we feel deep connections and loyalty to all of these different communities. The people in our professional community, the people in our social community, and the people in our ancestry. All 3 of these different domains of relationships anchor all of our identities. So adaptive work frequently requires sustaining some loss in some of that identity. And that requires then, you're asking people to renegotiate those loyalties. So you're asking a person, in a sense, to say, listen, my elder, I honor and cherish 95% of the wisdom that you've given me, and the lessons and the way of life and the love you've given me. But this 5% doesn't apply anymore. So I'm going to have to depart from this 5%. And I'm going to learn from these other people because they've got an innovation that's interesting to me, and that's going to help me conserve all of the wisdom you've given me. But I can't take all of it with me. Some of it is no longer adaptive to the world I'm in. Now that conversation is a very big emotional conversation for people. It takes place in their own heart. It takes place in person. Sometimes it takes place at a person's grave. When I wanted to have that conversation with some of my ancestors, I had to take my mother back to the old country, the villages in Europe where my grandparents were from, and visit the graves and commune with my ancestors. And I had to ask them, what do you want me to do about the ways in which you were desecrated and murdered? How am I supposed to honor you? Should I spend my life being angry? Because that's what I was, just angry. How am I supposed to honor you properly? And for me, I had to renegotiate that loyalty. I had to go physically to that location, and with my mother and hear her stories about the old country. She left when she was 12 years old, the old country, and came to America in 1938. The old country was Germany and Poland. So I think we have to understand that the losses we're asking people to sustain are significant. The renegotiating of loyalties can be done, but it's hard emotional work, and you have to help people accomplish it. And of course, this is not rocket science. I can't give you a textbook on how to help people renegotiate a loyalty. But you can discover how, differently for different people. For some people, they need to write a letter. So all these different kinds of losses, when you have a board of directors, like they'll say, some churches will split even because you want to change what melody is sung, or which hymns are. It's amazing when you think of these rabbis 2,000 years ago having to decide which books are going to be in and out of the Bible, and being able to stay in conversation. And yet churches split because somebody wants to sing a different kind of hymn. People really lose sight of proportion. And part of your job is to keep reinforcing the glue that holds people together so that they can sustain the divisive forces of the arguments that'll pull them apart as they work these three questions. Because those three questions are going to generate conflict. The board itself will start to be in conflict. Wait, no, we can't give that up. No, we have to give that up. Otherwise, we're not going to attract young people. Or we're not going to figure out how to do it online. We've got to run these experiments. All right, well, I think you're going to fail. Okay, well, that's okay. Will you simply bless the experiment? Sometimes it's easier to sell an experiment than it is to sell, I've got the right way. So I can't give you a very good answer to your question, Sam, except that the resistance you're facing in your board or with your congregants, probably you'll find answers if you move closer into it with curiosity and with heart rather than impatience, to try to understand what's the nature of the loss. What is it that you love? That you're worried about losing if we were to change. And that'll shape then the pacing at which you change. Maybe you have to go slower. Maybe you have to break it down into smaller pieces. Maybe you have to speak more towards what you're going to conserve so that you keep reminding people that we aren't losing everything. Mm-hmm. We're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but people forget that. That Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes.
It takes a long time because it takes a long time for Jimmy Stewart to realize his life really had value because, yes. All he was in the crisis, all he was aware of was the loss. People need to be reminded over and over again of the cultural DNA that you're going to conserve when you start talking about change, so that they can put the losses in the larger perspective of the gain.
Thank you, Ron. That was great.
I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
And there's a follow-up question to that, I think, which is, do you have some guidance on when that is scripture passages to be interpreted in a different way?
Yes, I have a strong feeling about that, and I think some of you may disagree with me. First of all, one of the great ways in which the Jewish community was enriched by outsiders was when we began to develop those rabbinic academies in which the great texts were written, the Talmud, commentaries were written. Those development of academies was a product of having been in contact with Greeks. Because the Greeks in the 500 years before Jesus had developed this beautiful relationship to learning through debate. And the Jews took that in. And so that rather than relying on the priests to tell everybody, this is what the text means. You began to have rabbis, teachers, develop these academies starting in about 400 BC or even 500 BC in Babylonia, because not all the Jews returned to the Holy Land. Many of them stayed in exile and developed rich communities in what is now Iraq and Iran, in the Middle East. And those academies thrived for many centuries. And what they discovered from the Greeks was this process of sitting across a narrow table with a big book in between two people. And if you go to a yeshiva, like at a school like in Yavne I described, you'll see long tables with two people sitting next to each other all down the table, on each side of the table, lines of paired up with this big book in between them, this Talmud in between them, discussing the text, arguing about what are the different ways to interpret the text. And the process of interpreting the text and entertaining and considering new and different interpretations of the text was itself considered a holy act. So the learning itself became holy. I discovered this when I went to visit. I'm sorry, we're going over time. I visited an elder cousin. I was only 22 years old. He was in his 80s. And I went to visit him my first time visiting Israel. He lived in a little apartment outside of Tel Aviv. And he looked so happy. And I said to my cousin, I said, Gershon, why are you so happy? And he said, well, every day I go to the local synagogue and I study with 5 or 10 other people, and we read the daily page. In Hebrew it's called the daily page, the daf yameh, the daily page. We read the daily page and we discuss the daily page. And I said, I was a young man, I said, well, what good is that? What are you doing it for? Because I thought, well, the learning must be for some reason. Are you trying to heal the sick? Are you trying to And he looked at me and he said, with joy in his eyes, he said, learning is sacred. And boy, it was a revelation to me. And then I went to visit that school in Yavne a few weeks later, and I saw the lines of these young men and old men across the table studying the text, debating what's the right interpretation of the text. And if you look at one of these pages of Talmud, the text itself is structured. It's a big book, literally it's like a foot and a half by a foot. It's a big book. It has a little piece of text in the middle, maybe 3 sentences, which is an ancient piece of text. It may be from the Bible itself. But then surrounding the text will be commentaries, a debate. And so around this sacred text, you have all these other commentaries on that central text. And each commentary is from a different rabbi. And the text itself compiles these different debates. And at the time when the Talmud was finally, closed, it captures, you have rabbis arguing with each other over hundreds of years. This rabbi disagrees with this rabbi who was 200 years earlier. And so you have this living interpretive tradition where the text is supposed to be renewed in each generation. The text is not considered a museum piece. So the idea that one begins to have a concrete, fixed interpretation of the text that is always true is, for me, a terrible loss. And when I see some Christian churches lose the interpretive freedom to bring the text alive in new ways, depending on the problems people are facing, I feel great sadness. I feel as if people are succumbing to the market for certainty. There's a deep yearning for certainty in an uncertain world. So religious people are saying, I'm going to sell certainty. And then you get competitions for certainty between different churches saying, I got certainty to sell. Come to me and I'll tell you exactly how you're supposed to live. Now, we see that also within Orthodox Judaism, that kind of certainty. So I would hope that you would see that the text is supposed to be living and that there's a good reason you have 4 Gospels, because none of the Gospels had the final truth. At the moment Jesus died, 2 Gospels said that this is what he said. You know, God, why have you forsaken me? In the words of David. One Gospel says, forgive them, they know not what they do. The other Gospel doesn't have anything, as if doesn't say what Jesus said, is sort of speechless. That's the beauty. You have 4 different interpretations. None of them is complete. You know, when you read Job, God says, wait a second, there's a big mystery you don't know. Where were you? You know, where were you when Pele created the volcano? Where were you? So I think that we need to re-engage people in the extraordinary spiritual experience of the great mysteries, instead of being so arrogant to think they know God's way, so that they can then have the human freedom of delighting in different interpretations, what applies, what doesn't apply. And I think that was part of what Jesus was trying to do when he tried to reform Judaism in his lifetime. He said, you know, some of these laws, they shouldn't apply anymore. They've gotten kind of stale. They've turned into bureaucracy. Anyway, I don't mean to preach to you, but that's my own particular point of view.
Ron?
Yes.
This is Wayne Ibarra from Honolulu.
Oh, hi, Wayne. You're in the big city.
Yeah. Have you ever integrated appreciative inquiry into your process of 3 questions?
Yes, I have not done so formally, but I think it's a wonderful framework. And if you do that, send it to me. I'd like to see how you begin to create the hybrid, the synergy. That would be a good. It's an intellectual frontier. So please push that frontier. Let me know what you discover.
Art from Community Church of Honolulu. I love this time of sharing. In going forth, taking this framework, the questions, I'm not too sure if in the future there's any way in which stories from different churches will be told using this particular framework. It just helps Community Church to see how others have brought forth innovation given the process. So that type of sharing to me is so invaluable for me personally, and I know for Community Church. So if there's a way in which it could just be a simple document showing the different categories and the outcome, I know many of us may have their own unique problems, but many of us share similar problems too, for growth and change in 2021 and going forth. I just want to throw this out to this group who spent this time of sharing. So thank you.
I feel really honored and inspired, and real pleasure to look into your faces and imagine into your worlds, and to get to be part of the world that you've created here in this wonderful, wonderful place. So thank you so much for including me in your community. All blessings.
You.
Thank you.